I know it's been unique, some of the work that we've been doing, but I think it's very important and definitely important to the state of Kansas. A reminder to turn your cell phones off and use your microphones when you're talking. Anybody that hasn't turned in their travel voucher, would you please do so also? Let's go ahead and get started with the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program Audit. Welcome, Heidi.
Good afternoon. All right. So my name is Heidi Zimmerman, and I am going to present an audit on the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit. So the team members for this audit were Josh Luthai, Maury Exline, Jonathan Jones, and Matt Etzel was the manager. It was a 2-question audit, and both of those questions are on page 2. We'll start with the first question. The question was, how do the Kansas Housing Resources Corporation's requirements and monitoring process for compliance reports, lease approvals, and rental approvals for the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program compare to federal and state law? So the short answer to that question, that very long question, so although KHRC's compliance monitoring process for the low-income housing tax credit is extensive, it does largely align with federal and state rules and best practices. Before I get into the details of that answer, I'm going to go through just a little background first, which starts on page 4. The Kansas Housing Resources Corporation, or KHRC, is tasked with overseeing federal and state housing programs. So at the federal level, KHRC oversees programs such as the Community Services Block Grants and the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit. At the state level, KHRC is responsible for administering the State Housing Trust Fund and the Affordable Housing Tax Credit. So for this audit, though, we're only going to focus on the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit. The Low-Income Housing Tax Credit, or LIHTC, is a federal program that awards federal income tax credits to housing developers to offset the cost of rental developments. So in return, developers agree to set aside a certain number of units for individuals whose income is under a particular threshold. So for example, developers can dedicate 40% of their units for individuals with income equal to or less than 60% of the state's mean gross income. And then in turn, the developers then receive 1/10 of their total credits each year for 10 years. The federal government requires each state to create a plan that describes how the state will administer LIHTC. So that plan describes things such as the LIHTC application process, eligibility criteria, and the compliance monitoring process. And it's the compliance monitoring process that this question focuses on. In 2023, 23 housing projects in Kansas received a low-income housing tax credit. The federal government requires KHRC to monitor housing developments that have been awarded LIHTC to ensure that they comply with all relevant rules. The federal government requires that KHRC monitors LIHTC developments for at least 15 years. KHRC must monitor the developments to ensure that the owners comply with the program rules and that the owners do all the things they said they would do when they received the credit. If they don't, they may not be eligible to continue to receive their tax credits or may have to pay back any credits they've already received. Federal Internal Revenue Code and federal regulations describe the requirements related to the LIHTC monitoring process. The IRS sets most of the expectations for how the program will be monitored because the program is a tax credit program. KHRC also monitors that developments comply with certain housing and urban development rules. They also monitor for compliance with some state laws. The federal rules that direct KHRC to monitor LIHTC projects are a mix of broad and specific requirements. So for example, the IRS requires KHRC to do some very specific things, such as ensuring developers certify that their units are suitable for occupancy. Conversely, other requirements allow KHRC great discretion in how to ensure compliance. Federal regulations also specifically permit KHRC to require more than the federal regulations do. So in response to these expectations, KHRC has created a compliance monitoring process to ensure that development owners comply with all the federal and state rules and that they meet the requirements they agree to when they receive LIHTC. So most of KHRC's monitoring process requires owners to submit forms and supporting documentation. Owners must do this annually for 30 years. So if you look on page 7, that figure provides an overview of that compliance monitoring process. So owners must submit 2 certification forms to KHRC. This includes a certificate of good standing and a certificate of program compliance. Owners must submit detailed financial information. This includes multiple forms that detail the development's budget and other financial information. Owners must also submit supporting documents such as profit and loss statements, year-end bank statements, and supporting documentation related to utility costs. Owners must then submit tenant information for tenants occupying a LIHTC unit. This information is collected on a 6-page form that the tenant and property manager typically work together to complete. The owner must enter parts of that form online annually. Then that form must also be maintained and made available to KHRC inspectors. Owners must submit supporting documentation related to completing specific activities. This includes things like training and fair housing activities. Additionally, owners must allow KHRC to inspect a sample of LIHTC units every 3 years. And then last, owners must pay an annual compliance fee to KHRC. The major concern behind this audit question, though, is that KHRC's compliance process might require a lot more than is strictly necessary. So we determined whether an aspect of KHRC's process was necessary based on 3 criteria. So when KHRC's requirement fulfilled a specific state or federal rule, we determined that aspect of the process was necessary. When rules were broad and provided discretion, we determined whether KHRC's process met best practices. So if KHRC's process satisfied a best practice, we determined that that part was necessary. When there was no best practice, we determined whether that aspect of the process was a good internal control. So an internal control increases the likelihood that an agency's objectives can be met. KHRC's objective is to ensure that federal rules are followed. If KHRC's process furthered their ability to do those things, then we determined that it was necessary. So what we found is that although KHRC's compliance monitoring process is extensive, most of the process is required by federal rules or is otherwise necessary for them to appropriately oversee the program. So if you look at figure 2, which is on page 11, that figure shows the reason each form, document, or activity is necessary. So for example, the financial information KHRC requires is necessary to satisfy federal regs and best practices. The tenant information KHRC requires is necessary because it satisfies federal law, best practices, and internal controls. So while most of the process was necessary, we did find 2 minor areas where KHRC's requirements are not necessary to meet a state or federal rule, a best practice, or an internal control. So KHRC requires that owners submit training certificates annually. But KHRC does not require developers or owners to receive any type of training. So requiring proof of training that is not actually required appears to be unnecessary. KHRC also requires that each property owner complete a fair housing activity and submit supporting documentation annually. Federal rules do not require owners to complete a fair housing activity. Under HUD requirements, it's KHRC that is responsible for completing fair housing activities. So although these tasks are unnecessary, they did not appear to be onerous or unreasonable. But to get a better sense of how easy or burdensome this process is to those who are actually participating in it, we surveyed developers. So we sent surveys to all 87 developers who received a LIHTC from 2016 to 2023. Of the 87, 19 responded. This is a response rate of 22%. As a result of that low response rate, we cannot project these results to all developers. But we asked respondents to tell us how easy or burdensome KHRC's overall compliance process is. 80% reported that overall the process was either easy or neither easy nor burdensome. We also asked about the requirement to submit training certificates and complete for housing activities. We asked about these tasks specifically because they were the tasks we identified as not being necessary. 87% reported that submitting training certificates was either easy or neither easy nor burdensome. 13% reported that the task was burdensome because it was time-consuming or costly. 94% reported that completing fair housing activities was, again, either easy or neither easy nor burdensome. The one person who reported that the task was burdensome said that it was because it was time-consuming and costly. We also asked respondents about their experiences with the compliance monitoring processes in other states. 9 respondents reported they had completed developments in other states. All 9 respondents reported that the compliance process in Kansas is either about the same or less burdensome than in other states. I should note here real fast that question 1 does refer to something called lease and rent approvals. Lease and rent approval rules require owners to seek approval from KHRC before leasing a unit or increasing the rent. But neither the state nor the federal government have such requirements for the LIHTC program. KHRC officials told us 2 related programs, though, do have lease and rental approval programs. However, we did not further evaluate those programs or their requirements because they are not LIHTC and thus fall out of the scope of this audit. So we'll move along to question 2, which is on page 15. The question is, are KHRC's requirements for reserves and land use covenants consistent across low-income tax credit housing developments? Short answer, KHRC's land use covenants and reserve requirements were consistent across the 16 projects we evaluated. But for a little more detail, KHRC requires owners to sign a land use restrictive covenant and maintain financial reserves as a condition of receiving LIHTC. So KHRC requires all development owners to sign a land use restrictive covenant for each LIHTC development. This covenant is an agreement between the owner and KHRC that documents the restrictions placed on the property in order to receive the tax credit. Among other things, it requires that even if the owner sells the property will remain a LIHTC development for 30 years. Federal regulation requires a restrictive covenant, but it does not specifically indicate what must be in it. Additionally, KHRC requires owners to have financial reserves for each project. Reserves are money the owner sets aside to maintain the property over time. So we looked at 2 types of reserves. One was operating reserves, which are meant to ensure low-income projects which might not increase rent to keep pace with upkeep costs to help ensure that it remains viable for 30 years. And then replacement reserves are to help pay for major property expenses. Federal regulations do not require reserves, but KHRC requires reserves because they are a best practice. So we reviewed the covenants for all 16 projects that were awarded LIHTC in 2022 and 2023 and had a signed covenant as of March of 2024. So we reviewed 16 out of 34 covenant terms to determine whether they were consistent across all 16 projects. For the 16 items we reviewed, the covenants imposed the same requirements on all 16 projects. So for example, all 16 projects required compliance with fair housing laws and that the covenant would remain in effect for 30 years. Additionally, as part of the survey that I just discussed, we asked developers their opinions on the covenants. We asked if they thought any of the covenant restrictions were inappropriate. 85% reported that they thought the terms in the covenant were appropriate. The 2 respondents who reported that they thought the terms were inappropriate did not clearly report what aspect of the covenant that they thought was problematic. We also reviewed the replacement and operating reserves for those same 16 projects, and the reserve amount KHRC required was consistent across all 16 developments we reviewed. Again, as part of that survey, we asked developers their opinions on the amount of reserves KHRC requires, and all the developers who responded to that question reported they thought the reserve amounts KHRC requires is about right. So in conclusion, KHRC is tasked with ensuring that developers and owners comply with federal and state rules and do all the things they said they would do when they received the credit. And although the process is very detailed, KHRC's compliance process is designed to ensure that federal rules are followed and best practices are implemented. We didn't make any recommendations for this audit. I'd be happy to stand for any questions.
Thank you, Heidi. Representative Williams.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So when we're looking on page 5 and trying to understand the scope of this, and I do appreciate the questions have been at least resolved that they are compliant. But to understand those who were compliant, you said there were 12 housing projects and 11 housing projects under the KHRC plan. So would those 11 also, I guess the question is, do they take part in both? Can they get the 4% and the 9%? How many overlapping projects and how many developers participated in these projects?
Most of that is a little out of the scope of this audit. However, in terms of developers, I can't tell you exactly the number of developers for those 12 and 11, because those are just the ones who received a LIHTC credit in that year. In terms of the 16, though, that we looked at in detail for question 2, it was 16 projects. I think our work papers would be able to tell you how many developers those 16 represented. So that's an information we could get you. But otherwise, that's a little more detailed than we have.
Well, but just looking on page 5, and it really just helps provide context to the overarching 2 questions. You have 12 housing projects and 11 housing projects. Just for clarity, can those be overlapping? So you could get the LIHTC 4% credit, and then you could also get the LIHTC 9%?
In this case, I do not believe those are overlapping.
Okay, and then just the last general comment for our committee that we were discussing is that these particular credits should be on the taxpayer transparency database that's on the Department of Commerce, and they're not there. So there was no way for anybody in this committee or the public to go and view these types of credits that are economic development incentives for those developers, not talking about the tax incentives or the credit incentives that would go to the individual lease renters. I'm just talking about the developer. So that is something that the Department of Commerce needs to continue to work on, or we need to clarify that.
Representative Williams, I think we've been going back and forth on this for a few years. We have asked Commerce in good faith and never seen the results that the legislature's been looking for. I think we're going to have to suggest some teeth, go into that language, that if that database is not put together, that we need to start doing some clawbacks. Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Representative Tarwater.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So this audit, I think, was requested on behalf of a constituent of mine, and one of his complaints, I think, was that he was seeing more stringent requests on some projects than others. And you're saying of the 16 you looked at, there were no inconsistencies. They were all asked for the same items, the same timeline, and all that.
For the 16 projects that we looked at their covenants and we looked at their reserve requirements, which was what the audit question was about. And for those 16 projects, we did not see inconsistency across those 16. They were asked for the same things, and the requirements were the same across all the projects.
Okay, so did you look at like lease requirements or raising rent or anything like that?
The lease and rent approvals are not part of LIHTC. So when I talked a minute ago about the question refers to rent approvals and lease approvals, but LIHTC, the lowest income housing tax credit, does not require those things. There are other programs that are similar to LIHTC that do require those, but this audit was for LIHTC, and so that's just not a requirement for the program at hand.
Got it. Thank you very much. Thanks, Madam Chair.
Any other questions, committee? Seeing none, thank you, Heidi. Next on the agenda committee is, oh, we do. Would you like to ask them questions? Yes. A representative from Alicia? I don't think I pronounced that right. Sorry.
It's Alyssa. Thank you. Alyssa
Alyssa,
Ice. Thank
okay.
you. Is it on? I don't, okay. Thank you, committee. My name is Alyssa Ice. I'm the Director of Housing Development for Kansas Housing Resources Corporation. I also have Katie Whitehead with me. She's the Director of Compliance at KHRC. We appreciate LPA's interest in the review in the LIHTC program, as well as the opportunity from the committee to make a statement. And we commend the post-audit for a thorough and thoughtful review of this vital and technical program and our administration of it. We were also pleased with the determination that KHRC's LIHTC program requirements and processes align with the applicable law and industry best practices, and the KHRC's application of the requirements is consistent and equitable. The federal and now state LIHTC program is a cornerstone of KHRC's mission in developing safe, affordable housing across the state of Kansas. We welcome input from policymakers and stakeholders through the Qualified Allocation Plan process and the Compliance Policies and Procedures Manual process, which occurs annually and determines how the LIHTC program is administered. Thank you for your review and support of this vital program. Thank you, and I'll take any questions you have.
Thank you. Representative Tarwater, then Representative Williams.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So on the reserve requirements, do you, you require quite a bit more than the federal program?
So there is no federal program requirement. What we require the state or the best practices that our the larger it's called NCSHA, the Housing Association. We have a best practice document that we go through every few years. Oftentimes, the syndicator or the equity provider will require higher reserves than we require, but we require a consistent amount across all of our projects.
Okay, so one of the things that I'm hearing is that the high reserve requirements ties up a large sum of money for 15 years or longer, and that's money that could be used to build more low-income housing if they were able to use it. Is that something that you're willing to look at?
We certainly will, and I'll let Katie correct me if I'm misstating, but we do receive requests to look at those reserve requirements after year 15, which is when the initial compliance period is over. And if there is if the property is in good shape, if they have, if there's not a foreseeable need, we will talk with them about reducing those requirements.
So I guess what I'm saying is, why wait the 15 years? I mean, is there a better, if it's not a federal requirement, it's a state requirement, can we work on that a little bit in order, I mean, we have a housing issue, and we have a tremendous shortage, and we're tying up large sums of money from developers and builders and investors that want to build more. And wouldn't it be better to have them build more than, and maybe have a lower reserve?
We can certainly look at it and talk about it. A lot of these requirements are also coming in from the investor standpoint, so we can look at that, but a lot of times the investor will still require that best practice. And just one more note is that the tax credit and the syndicator is attached to the deal for 15 years, and so they also want to make sure we cannot invest any more credits into those projects if something happens to them in that 15 years, and so those reserves are meant to keep those units operable for those 15 years.
So if something did happen, though, to the complex, or it fell below the norms, the tax credit would stop, right?
It's possible, yes.
Wouldn't that be incentive enough to have them stay on top of the maintenance?
I would think so, but I think that there's certain situations where the rents are depressed, and so that there isn't the ability, there's not that income to bring those units back online.
All right. Well, thank you, Madam Chair.
Representative Williams.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So looking at the compliance list that was provided in this audit and trying to understand that compliance list, there was a question previously that there is no rent requirements for setting rent for those individuals that live in these low-income housing. But I'm looking on the website that provides LIHTC compliance guidelines, and it does have a rent calculator. So can you clarify, are those developers, owners of these housing complexes, are they able to set rent for that percentage of low-income residents at any rate, or are they also, are they having to use a Section 8 calculator?
Thank you for the question. So so we don't approve rent increases, but there is a set maximum rent by the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program. And so that is by county, and it's updated every year. And so a lot of times the rents will be far below that required amount, that required maximum. And so every year when those rents increase or stay stagnant, they can increase up to the maximum amount. It's a different calculation than the Section 8 property, but yes, it is, that is the required maximum rent amount.
And for this program that you, it says here that you get 85 pieces of information for each household, and that the KHRC reviews a sample. Number one, would you be able to give us an idea of what is the sample size, and do you see compliance in all of those 85 areas? And number two, for this program, or these two types of LIHTC programs, how many different, I know we have 16 different projects that were reviewed, or 12 housing projects for the first, 11 for the second. How many developers are we talking about?
That's a good question, and I'll let Katie come up and answer the question about the income verification. I don't know the exact number of developers that we have. Our qualified allocation plan lays out how many projects a developer can have at any time going, and we have a maximum number of developments a developer can get each year, and so they cannot get more than 3 projects a year, and they cannot have any more than 4 going at any time.
And so is it also correct that they cannot layer the credits? They can't have the first type of LIHTC and layered with the second? And then just the final question, it says that they can also receive a state tax credit on top of that. What is that amount?
So that is correct, that we cannot give a 4 and a 9 to the same project, so that it will either be a 4% project or a 9% project. And the statute requires that all of the projects get a federal credit and a state credit, so they get the same amount of federal and state low-income housing tax credits.
All right, thank you.
Do you mind if I turn it over to Katie to?
No, that would be fine. I do have a question on location, though, where a majority of these tax credits are being used at in the state.
Thank you. So our 9% projects are generally outside of our metropolitan areas. We, for qualified allocation purposes, define our metropolitan as the 5 most populated counties. Those projects are going to be 50 units or less, and so those will be in our more rural or micropolitan areas. The 4% credit it requires a project that is significantly larger because of the cost associated with it, and so those projects are going to be in our metropolitan area. So most of them are in Sedgwick, Johnson, Wyandotte, Douglas, and Shawnee.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, thanks. Can you hear me? Okay, so the first question.
State your name.
Oh, I'm sorry, Katie Whitehead, Compliance Director. The sample size question you asked about, it's 20% of the project. So we look at 20% of the tenant files, and then 20% of the actual units for physical deficiencies. The 85 pieces of information, that's collected during the tenant income certification process. So questions are about the household size, relevant income and assets to make up the total household income to make sure that they qualify under that limit.
Follow up? Any other questions, committee? Thank you. Committee will move on to the next audit, the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families Program. Sam?
Good afternoon, committee. My name is Sam Dadds. I'm a senior auditor with Legislative Post Audit, and I'm presenting the performance audit reviewing the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families Program. Representative Barbara Ballard requested this audit, which was authorized by this committee April 25th, 2023. This was a two-question audit. Question one is, how has the percentage of TANF funding provided directly to families changed over time? And question two is, what impact have changes to TANF rules since 2011 had on program outcomes? Team members for this audit were Macy Smith and Ellen Slicker, and Matt Etzel managed this audit. So the answer to question one is on the top of page 3. Since 2009, the percentage of spending going towards cash assistance decreased by 39%, while assistance caseloads also decreased significantly during that time. Before we get into the details of the answer, I'd like to go over some background information that begins on page 3. So the federal government created the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program in 1996 through the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act of 1996. This act replaced aid to families with dependent children, and TANF provides states with an annual block grant based on the amount of funding states receive from aid to families with dependent children funding before 1996. So TANF has 4 purposes, and those purposes are to help needy families so that children can be cared for in their own homes, to reduce dependency by promoting job preparation, work, and marriage, to prevent out-of-wedlock pregnancies, and to encourage the formation and maintenance of two-parent families. So TANF gives states broad flexibility when spending federal TANF funds, and the only requirement is that states must spend TANF funds on qualified individuals or programs that a reasonable person would consider to be within the 4 purposes of TANF. Kansas receives about $102 million from the TANF block grant annually, and this amount has remained generally stable since 1996. But what this means is the federal government hasn't adjusted the block grant for inflation since the start of the program. And we'll talk about the effects of inflation a little later in the report. So in Kansas, DCF administers those TANF funds. And since FY13, DCF funded about 50 programs with the TANF block grant. Some examples include foster care services, TANF employment services, and cash assistance, which is the topic of the audit. To receive TANF funds, Kansas must meet its maintenance of effort with state funds annually, and that's about $62 million to $66 million per year. These payments can be made towards any program or activity that supports a TANF family directly or indirectly. Kansas typically claims the Earned Income Tax Credit as its primary expenditure towards the TANF maintenance of effort. So if states offer cash assistance in their TANF programs, states must enforce TANF work requirements, determine paternity for children of cash assistance recipients, and ensure families don't exceed the lifetime federal limit of 60 months of cash assistance benefits. So although states may offer cash assistance, they're not required to because TANF isn't an entitlement program. And what that means is that if states do offer cash assistance, the states set their own income eligibility requirements. And in Kansas, TANF cash assistance serves families with very low incomes. Generally, in Kansas, a family is eligible for TANF cash assistance if they have insufficient income or resources to support themselves, and funds must be granted to families that live in Kansas. The family must include a child or expectant mother who is a U.S. citizen, legal immigrant, or qualified immigrant. And insufficient income is determined by many factors. So this includes things like household size, county of residence, and income. And this means income eligibility requirements vary from household to household. So as an example, a family of 2 in Shawnee County living in non-shared housing must earn less than $326 in total countable income per month before they're eligible for TANF cash assistance. This income threshold is going to be lower in more rural counties, and it's going to be higher in more urban counties. A little bit of background information about some changes that happened with TANF eligibility requirements and TANF. So on page 5, we get into the HOPE Act. In 2015, the state enacted the Hope, Opportunity, and Prosperity for Everyone Act, and that changed the eligibility requirements for cash assistance in Kansas. Some notable changes included reducing the lifetime limit for cash assistance from a total of 48 months to 24 months, and adding tiered penalties for cash assistance recipients not adequately complying with work activity requirements or not cooperating with child support services, the maximum penalty being 10 years of TANF ineligibility. Additional changes included reducing the amount of time single caregivers are exempt from work requirements and adding prohibitions on where EBT cards could be used. On page 7, we discuss our method for answering question 1. So we reviewed state financial reports, internal DCF reports, and TANF plans to categorize and calculate the state's TANF cash assistance block grant expenditures. We reviewed 5 state financial reports from fiscal year '09 to fiscal year '23 and intermittent years. And we focused on cash assistance paid with the TANF block grant because generally Kansas doesn't pay for cash assistance with state funds. This means other forms of cash assistance like one-time special TANF dollars appropriated through the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act and federal pandemic relief funds were not included in our totals. And we did this to maintain consistency across the years that we reviewed. And it's important to note that comparing our calculations to DCF's federal reports may not align. This is because federal fiscal year begins in October, and the state has a broader definition of administrative cost. So I'll discuss our method for determining the changes in caseloads and the effects of inflation on cash assistance when we get to that section. So just to emphasize question 1 again, how has the percentage of TANF funding provided directly to families changed over time? And that would be since FY '09, total spending on TANF cash assistance has decreased by about 39%. So I'm on page 7 looking at figure 1. And in this section, we're talking about cash assistance paid with the $102 million TANF block grant that the state receives annually. So figure 1 shows spending on all TANF programs as a percentage of the total block grant. And as figure 1 shows, spending on TANF cash assistance has decreased from about 15% of block grant spending to about 9% of block grant spending from FY '09 to FY '23. And that'll be the dark orange bars on the figure. Looking ahead at figure 2 on page 8. Figure 2 shows spending on TANF cash assistance has also decreased in total over time. You'll see that TANF cash assistance expenditures decreased from about $15.2 million in FY '09 to about $9.4 million in FY '23. It's about a 39% decrease across those 14 years. So what figure 2 is showing you is the dollar value of those dark orange bars in figure 1. Spending on some other program categories increased over the same period, if you'd like to look at figure 1 on page 7 again. For example, foster care and prevention services was the program category with the largest increase in spending since FY '09. As figure 1 shows, spending on foster care and prevention services increased from about 7% of block grant spending to about 32% of block grant spending since fiscal year '09. And that means spending increased from about $7 million to $32 million across those 14 years. It's about a $25 million increase. DCF officials said the increase in spending was because increased focuses on preventative services for foster care. Finally, DCF officials also explained that they transfer a portion of the TANF block grant to the Social Services Block Grant and the Child Care Development Fund for the 5 fiscal years that we reviewed. Those are the gray bars in figure 1. Note that those bars represent transfers and any unspent block grant funds. Federal law allows states to transfer up to 30% of the TANF block grant to the Social Services Block Grant and the Child Care Development Fund annually. DCF officials explained that the remaining TANF block grant funds were retained for use in future years, and they said that the state draws TANF funds from the federal government as needed, drawing from the oldest remaining funds first. On page 8, we discuss the average monthly cash assistance aid per person. So this information came from an internal DCF report that tracks cases that received any form of cash assistance. This includes pandemic relief funds or those ARA funds we discussed. It's a tool DCF uses to make future caseload estimates. We use this report to get an idea of how DCF's cash assistance caseloads and aid changed over time because it was the best option we had available. DCF officials couldn't provide us with a client-level caseload data that we had requested because their staff couldn't retrieve the information during our work. We did not audit this internal report. So according to DCF's internal caseload report from FY '09 to FY '23, Kansas's average monthly aid per person receiving any cash assistance remained stable over the years that we reviewed. This was between $111 and $118 per person per month. This means that while cash assistance caseloads are decreasing, eligible families receive about the same amount of aid per person as they did in FY '09. And this is because the benefit amounts in Kansas haven't been updated since 1997. On page 9, you'll find figure 3. Figure 3 shows the average monthly number of cash assistance cases for all forms of cash assistance. And you'll see that the caseloads decreased from about 12,600 average monthly cases in FY '09 to 2,900 average monthly cases in FY '23. which is about a 77% decrease in average monthly cash assistance cases. What this means is that the decrease in cash assistance spending that we see isn't unexpected. A few factors may contribute to Kansas's decrease in cash assistance caseloads. As an example, it's possible that the eligibility changes made through the HOPE Act reduce TANF cash assistance caseloads. Increasing wages and inflation may also reduce cash assistance caseloads because Kansas's eligibility requirements and benefit amounts haven't been updated since 1997. What this means is it's harder to qualify for TANF in 2023 because families are being measured against what was considered in need in 1997. And the cash assistance has less purchasing power than it did in 1997, which may dissuade families from applying. So on page 10, we discuss some of the effects of inflation on cash assistance's purchasing power. We use the Bureau of Labor Statistics Consumer Price Index Urban Average to estimate the effects of inflation on Kansas's TANF block grant and the average monthly cash assistance aid per person. So on that 102 million, we estimated that by 2023, Kansas's TANF block grant lost about 49% of its purchasing power since 1996. And looking over at figure 4 on page 11, figure 4 shows all cash assistance purchasing power decreasing since FY09 when compared to the average monthly aid per person. So we estimate what it means. We estimated the purchasing power of the average monthly aid per person in FY09. That would be $118 per month in constant 2009 dollars. But by FY23, that purchasing power of the average monthly aid per person decreased to about $81 in 2009 dollars, while the nominal aid remained relatively unchanged. So that's about a 30% decrease in purchasing power since FY09. And again, these numbers may include other forms of cash assistance. So moving on to question 2. What impact have changes to TANF rules since 2011 had on program outcomes? So the answer to question 2 is found on page 11. And that answer is researchers and stakeholders had mixed opinions on the impact TANF rule changes in Kansas had on program outcomes since FY11. So we tried to evaluate the impact of Kansas's TANF rule changes since 2011, and that's because starting in 2011, TANF cash assistance policy changes were made inside of DCF that would later become part of the HOPE Act that we discussed. The HOPE Act codified those policy changes into law and changed the cash assistance eligibility rules in Kansas. And as a quick recap, the total lifetime time limits for cash assistance were decreased. Tiered penalties were added for not cooperating with child support services or complying with work requirements. The amount of time single caregivers were made exempt from work requirements was reduced, and prohibitions were made against where EBT cards could be used. So page 12 discusses our methods for answering question 2 and our findings from the literature review. The lack of Kansas-specific outcomes data limited our evaluation to reviewing academic literature and stakeholder testimony. So we requested DCF provide us with client-level TANF data for those criteria occurring before and after their TANF cash assistance case to try and measure outcomes ourselves. Examples of outcome criteria we requested included income, employment, whether they were employed full-time or part-time, and whether they were receiving food assistance before and after TANF. DCF couldn't provide us with sufficient data during our work to answer question 2 with a regression model. So instead, we selected 8 peer-reviewed studies from other states or nationally that had relevant information on rule changes and outcomes that could be used to explain similar effects in Kansas. So as an example, we included some studies that involve TANF programs that included sanctions for TANF clients if they didn't participate in work activities, because Kansas also has those rules. We also interviewed stakeholders and reviewed their testimony to the legislature to learn how changes in Kansas's TANF program might have impacted program outcomes since 2011. Those stakeholders included DCF officials, researchers, and policy advocates, including the Foundation for Government Accountability, Center on Budget Policies and Priorities, and Kansas Action for Children. So the research we reviewed suggested that TANF rules, like those in Kansas, lead to mostly negative program outcomes for TANF families. I'll provide only a few examples from this section for the sake of time. So one single study, state study that we looked at, suggests that TANF recipients in Florida who experienced sanctions had lower earnings up to a year after receiving the sanction than those who were not sanctioned. This study controlled for earnings pre-TANF assistance. The research we reviewed also suggests that TANF rules that reduce TANF caseloads, such as time limits that are less than the federal ceiling of 60 months, negatively impact measures of well-being for families and children. One example of that is one national study we reviewed suggests that rules that limit those caseloads are associated with increased child maltreatment cases and foster care placements. Now, this is important because, according to DCF officials, out-of-home foster care placements in Kansas increased from FY09 to FY19. DCF officials told us that in FY19, the state dedicated funding for additional foster care prevention services. And since FY19, the average out-of-home foster care placement totals have decreased. However, we did not audit these totals. And finally, one national study we reviewed suggests that restrictive TANF rules reduce poverty at the state level. But the same study also suggests that states with less restrictive TANF rules reduce poverty at similar or higher rates than states with the most restrictive TANF rules. And this was the only study we reviewed to actually address that topic. So finally, on page 13, we discuss our findings from the stakeholders. And stakeholders had mixed opinions about the impact of work sanctions in Kansas. As an example, a report from the Foundation for Government Accountability estimated Kansas's work participation sanctions increased the combined earnings of adults leaving TANF between October 2011 and March 2015 by about 3.5 times. And what they did is they estimated the combined annual income and earnings growth of about 17,000 individuals representing 6,000 families over a 4-year period using limited earnings data. So at the baseline, the families had a combined income of about $19.5 million annually. That was the estimate. And after 4 years, they estimated that the families had a combined annual income of about $67.6 million annually. The Center on Budget Policies and Priorities also reviewed the same data and noted that the individuals' estimated combined earnings were still below the poverty line. For example, they note the combined earnings estimate of $67.6 million across about 6,000 families is $11,100 per family per year. And they also suggest that estimating annual earnings based off of limited earnings data could bias the income estimates upward or downward. Finally, DCF and Kansas Action for Children officials thought that the increasing penalties for noncompliance with TANF work programs may be counterproductive. They thought that the penalties made it harder for TANF participants to work under DCF supervision and caused participants to lose momentum towards their goals, such as economic self-reliance. For example, a KAC analysis from about 2009 to 2013 noted that TANF caseloads declined, but enrollment in other safety net programs, such as food assistance and Medicaid, increased over that period. What that does is, it suggests decreasing TANF caseloads don't indicate a decreased need. We didn't have any recommendations for this audit. I'd be happy to stand for any questions.
Senator Thompson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for the audit. Quick question. You mentioned that you didn't include the ERA or the COVID funds in this calculation, or some of the calculations you had. Do you know if any of those COVID funds were available to people who are eligible for TANF?
I believe they were in the documentation that we've seen. Would probably be best to ask DCF. They would be able to give you a more exact number. Yeah,
because I'm wondering if that was a factor in decreasing the number of caseloads or not, and I don't know. And also curious about the adjustment in the inflation since 1997. Is that a federal decision not to adjust that inflation rate, or is that a state policy decision?
So, the inflation adjustment for the
eligibility requirements, it looks like it hasn't been adjusted since 1997.
Oh, okay. So the state sets its own income threshold. That's our decision at the state level, and then the federal government determines the grant amount. So, for example, that $102 million that Kansas receives, that hasn't been adjusted either.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Representative Probst.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I might have a follow-up on that. Just make sure I understand how the math is working. The $102 million hasn't been adjusted. If Kansas, though, increased the income threshold, does that change the grant amount?
If we changed our income threshold, no, our grant remains the same. That has to be done at the federal level. So we still get $102 million every year.
Okay.
Any other question? Representative Francis.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So again, going back to this 102 million, that number is stagnant based upon a federal decision. Whatever we do internally can't affect the amount of the block grant from the federal government?
That's correct. That's the federal government has to deal with that $102 million if they want to increase it.
And then if the number of caseloads increases, and of course we've got that dollar amount that they each receive, that then just takes away from other programs, some of those other numbers that you talked about, some of the other spending areas.
So what you're asking is that if caseloads were to increase, if there was an increased need for cash assistance in Kansas, DCF would probably have to pull funding from other programs that are taking from that $102 million pile.
Right. So, yeah, if we take away some, we're going to lose somewhere else. And then I guess my third question is, you said something about unspent funds. They accrue until they're spent. Do you have any idea what the dollar amount of those unspent credits are?
We don't know what the dollar amount is. I could give you an example off the top of my head would be, I believe in FY23, there's about 4% that was unspent, that we had tracked as unspent, roughly. We can give you a closer example because that includes the unspent funds and the transferred funds.
Right, but then that can compound. If every year we're not spending, that number can grow?
Theoretically, it could grow if we don't spend it.
Is it growing?
We don't know if it's growing or not.
And can they get us that information about what the unspent balance is?
We could talk to DCF and get that.
Thank you.
Any other questions? I have a couple. So it looks like the administration cost is very expensive for this program. I mean, we're looking at 17 to 13%. That seems high. I don't care who the administration is. I just think that's a lot of money that it isn't getting to the people in need.
We didn't make any determinations on if they were spending the money effectively or anything like that, but those administrative costs are going to look different depending on which report you look at. So that's using the state's definition of administrative costs on the federal administrative cost. See if I can give you the example would be, I believe I have an example in the report. The federal administrative cost would be salary and benefits for staff providing providing TANF services directly to families. I believe they are not incorporated under admin costs. They would be under program costs. We actually counted those under admin costs due to the way the state classifies the administrative costs.
So if that's money that's getting to the recipients, the benefactors, then that's misleading as to being under the admin cost.
What's that?
I would like to see a breakdown of what is actually being spent on admin, because approximately, if you're talking 102 million, 13%, I mean, we're talking over $13 million. So that's a lot of money to be, committee, okay, I don't want to overstep here, but I just think that's a lot of money to administer this program. And so could you look into it and find out what those actual dollars are? And yes, Representative Pro.
Along those lines, I want to make sure, because I think you answered this, I want to make sure. When you calculate the administrative cost, a big chunk of the money is going to foster care prevention services and to other TANF programs. Some of that administrative cost is for those programs, is that right?
Yes.
Okay, so that's all included. And then just generally, I don't know if this certainly would have been outside the scope of your audit, but there is external data that indicates that means-tested programs, the more means that we provide to test, the more administrative costs there are. Like, meaning that the more hurdles we put for people to access the funds, that by default increases administrative cost. I know that wouldn't have been in your audit, but there is definitely external evidence to support that we do a lot of things to try to reduce the cost of running these programs, but I just want to make sure the committee knows that when we create more hurdles for people to jump through, we're also creating more administrative cost on those programs.
Thank you. So I'll continue with my questioning on the foster care. It is a considerable increase. Was that a legislative decision or an administrative decision?
That's an administrative decision.
So the legislature had nothing to do with that?
No.
Okay. I just wanted to be clear on that. The other question I have, so I do know that we put in place a check for Social Security. Is that one of the checks that is being administered? They were checking for electronic verification of identification so that we are not giving benefits to people who did not enter the country legally.
Oh, so we didn't get into what kind of checks they were doing as far as how they were determining eligibility or anything like that that was outside of the audit scope.
So fraud and abuse would have been outside of the scope also?
It would have been outside of the scope. It's an audit. If we would have seen anything that would indicate fraud abuse, we'd be obligated to look at it.
Well,
We didn't see
I know a
anything
few
that
years
was
they
outside
were
of scope.
talking about cash receipts from cruise lines, from a baseball game in Colorado. Did you check anything like that for the cash?
No, we didn't get into that level of detail of looking at like individual receipts or anything like that.
Okay. I know that's a fairly simple report to request. Maybe we could request it for additional, I know you have a little bit of wiggle room on additional work on this. So I'll add that to your list. Any other questions, committee? Senator Thompson.
Yeah, there was just one. It mentioned that legal immigrant or qualified immigrant. What's a qualified immigrant?
So I could get you the exact definition, but to not leave you hanging, the qualified immigrant would be somebody who is, I guess, on a visa in the country legally, but still eligible.
Work visa? Okay, work visa. Okay, thank you.
So I do have a couple more quick questions. DCF couldn't provide us with the sufficient data. Why not?
The simple answer is their staff were new and they couldn't query the database. There are two databases that they use. One of them they had to contract out, and the other one that they use, they have new staff who can't access it.
Don't even know what to say to that. According to, I shouldn't have commented, I'm sorry. Would it be worthwhile going back to see if they could query it now at a later date? Or do you feel, I mean, we're not using the state's data for this.
The issue there was the time and the expertise needed to query the database. And so if they haven't been working on it since we dropped that part of the audit, we're still looking at the same amount of time it would take them to go through that process. And we don't know how long that would take.
To run a query in a database?
Well, they have to write it.
According, DCF's here, okay. According to DCF officials, this is just for me, clarification, out-of-home foster care. I don't know what that terminology is.
Sorry, out-of-home foster care placements? Those are children who are removed from their home and placed into foster care services.
Okay, so this is when DCS takes them away from their current home?
Correct.
Okay, that's what I needed clarification. Thank you. Any other questions, committee? Seeing none, thank you very much, Sam.
Thank you very much.
So Dr. Carla Whiteside Hicks is here from DCF. Welcome to the committee.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Carla Whiteside Hicks, Director of Economic and Employment Services for DCF. And did you have questions?
So I guess I'll defer to you. DCF could not provide us with sufficient data during the course of our work.
So two different systems. We have what is called CASES, which is our legacy system. It is a DOS-based system. That system has been retired and replaced with KEYS, which is our new system. So the information, we have data available in CASES. We have data available in KEYS. The data points don't match up line by line. So we can compare the data. It takes longer than the amount of time that we had available for this audit. So we do have the data. It will just take a longer period of time to be able to compare data.
Representative Williams.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It says on page 7, there's 12% of the funds in 2023 that were either transferred or unspent. What is that total, and is it saving up for something in particular?
No, I can get that information. I do not have the actual numbers. No, we're not saving necessarily for anything in particular. We do like to keep a balance, and I can give you an example. Recently, we were told that in the proposed continuing resolution at the federal level for the budget, that TANF was not included in that. It has been since added, I believe just last night, TANF was added. So in a case like that where we may have a gap in being able to access our current federal funds, we want to make sure that we have a balance from a previous year so that we can continue to pay staff, we continue to pay benefits and to clients.
Okay, and then would that be if we have the maintenance of effort and plus what the federal gives, 102, would that be about 170 million per year in TANF fund?
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
So I'm going to follow up with the KEYS versus DOS. So you have two different data systems, and the data doesn't match from those systems.
Not line by line. The old system, the legacy system, was built, I believe, in the 1980s. Very outdated. And so based on federal regulations and some other things, there's again, the data's there. It just, the data dictionaries do not match line by line. So I can compare date of birth over here to date of birth over here, but they may not be labeled the same. And so it just takes longer to be able to compare the data. It is possible, it just takes longer to do.
But these are reports requesting totals, not line by line birth dates, and these are reports that are totals. I guess I don't get that. And DOS, is that the name of the, or is that the operating system?
Very old operating system.
That means you're on a PC for that system?
For that, the legacy system, yes. I mean, black screen, green letters, that's how old that screen was, yes.
Yeah, wow. I just question how accurate the data is in both of these systems then, but that's a whole nother issue. Okay, I guess the question would come to you too about the administrative cost. Maybe you could provide for the committee, not asking you off the cuff, just provide to us what your administrative cost is for this, because that does look like an exorbitant number.
Yep, I agree. So administrative cost, as was mentioned, the federal definition and the Kansas definition are not the same. They do not align. So with that, administrative costs, that is how we pay salaries for our administrative staff, not only within DCF administration, but any TANF-funded agreement that we have. I believe the audit reported more than 50 agreements. Every agreement that we have will have administrative cost associated with it, because the assumption, well, not the assumption, but in that agreement, that organization is paying staff. And if the duties of staff members are determined to be administrative functions, then that would be included in the administrative cost. So it's not just DCF cost, it's those community organizations also.
So I would question the efficiency as to Kansas administering this program so that the money is actually getting to the people in need. So another thing that didn't come up in the audit was the EITC, the actual funding that is used. I think it would be interesting if you could provide the committee a list of the funding mechanisms that Kansas uses in order to qualify for TANF money.
You mean the grants, the contracts, the agreements that we have? So the community organizations, those 50? No.
I'm not asking for that at all.
Okay.
What funding mechanisms are spending that Kansas uses to qualify for TANF money? Could you give us a list of those?
Okay.
Yeah, I think that would be interesting to the committee. Representative Tarwater.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks for being here to answer questions. One thing jumped out at me at the very end of this audit. It says DCF in Kansas Action for Children officials thought that that increasing penalties for noncompliance with TANF work programs may cause participants to lose momentum towards their goals, such as economic self-reliance. How can making somebody work possibly inhibit them from economic self-reliance? Or what about not working propels them towards that goal?
I believe that what that would refer to, for example, if I am receiving TANF and I am enrolled in a CNA program, I am required to connect with my career navigator, that's the DCF staff assigned to that person. So I'm required to check in with my DCF contact every 2 weeks. Well, if I miss one appointment, I could be sanctioned for that. And so if I'm no longer receiving TANF, I may not be able to complete that CNA program, and then I have to start all over again. So it's not necessarily that I'm not working. There are various reasons that someone would be sanctioned.
So it's more of an organization thing. We're kind of teaching them to be organized at the same time as we're teaching them to work.
We are sometimes
Bailey?
teaching life skills, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Representative Probst and Senator Warren.
Yeah, two things, Madam Chair. First, the list of 50 contractors that we provide money to, I would like to see that list if we at all could. Okay. There's a couple of things I think broadly I want to mention as we talk about this. One issue on this, like slowing momentum, I think I would encourage anyone on the committee that doesn't have firsthand experience with people in poverty. I work for an organization that does work directly with people in poverty. The places we're asking them to go to check to get these benefits are open during business hours, and often they have to take time off of work, which then results in them losing their job. So we have a system that really doesn't encourage functional employment. We say, if you need benefits and you're trying to work at the same time, we're going to make your life very, very complicated because, and we have a DCF community or center in our community, and the wait times are absurdly long. And sometimes I've had people call me and say, I've used all of my money that I have available on gas to go talk to them about my food benefits, and I had to take 3 days off of work to make this happen. So we don't have a functional system that's working this way. The other thing that we should talk about is the cliff effect, which isn't specifically to here, but we do have a system also that has a very hard line once people hit a certain income level as they're working their way out of poverty, where we then pull the rug out from underneath them. And I have talked to people firsthand who end up taking a job that makes less money because it's not sustainable for them in that window of time to continue working. And we could have a moral debate about that. But the fact is that we have a window where we're not giving people a slope off of these benefits. We're giving them, pushing them off an edge, and it doesn't often work as well as we would like it to.
Thank you. And if you would like to work on that, I would enjoy working with you. Yeah, I think there's many of us legislators that would agree with that. We don't agree with the cliff, and if we can do anything to address it, we sure would. Senator Warren and then Representative Tarwater.
Senator Ware, actually.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, right. I very much appreciate what Representative Probst had to say, and I guess I would just add, just to kind of put an extra pin in it, that we are talking about folks whose income is $326 a month. And so there's no wiggle room there that I can imagine. I can't, it's beyond me. Transportation, having availability to a computer if you need it, childcare, if that's part of the scenario. There are so many things that those of us who are blessed enough to not be in that position don't always think about. And so, I would love to be part of creating a solution.
Thank you, Senator Ware, and I apologize. Yeah. Almost Senator Tarwater, Representative Tarwater. I'm so used to first names, you guys, and I don't want to disrespect you, so I'm definitely.
Thank you, Madam Chair. That's what happens when we all become friends. We start calling each other by first names. So I wanted to piggyback on what Jason, Representative Probst said. Are we really that inflexible? Are we making people leave work, take time off work to come check in to tell us they're working? Is that a true thing?
That could happen.
Well, is that something the legislator needs to address, or is that something you guys can address and be more flexible?
It is something that I'm addressing internally. We currently, I have a contract with Change and Innovation Agency, and they just finished a process of reviewing our processes to determine how effective we are, where do we have overlap, where do we have gaps, and I am expecting a presentation from them in the next 2 weeks. And they've been looking, sorry, the contract that I have with them now is specifically for TANF employment services. So those individuals who are working one-on-one with our TANF recipients who are trying to enter the workforce or to increase their skills so that they can earn more money to support their families. And based on the recommendations from CIA, I anticipate some significant changes in how we engage our clients.
Okay, so, Madam, thank you. Thanks for looking at it. When can we expect some sort of changes to go into effect?
Some of them will be immediate. And when I say immediate, I mean, I'm expecting a report from CIA by the end of September. There will be some changes that will be effective in October of this year.
Okay.
And some will take longer.
I understand that, but this clearly has been an issue for a very long time. Why are we just now looking at, why do we need a report to tell us it's an issue? Because it's an issue. Can we just fix it? Why does everything have to take months and months and years to do? We have people out there that we're trying to train to work, and we're making them leave work to come tell us they're working. It makes no sense. Can't we just fix it?
So I don't want to pretend, I don't want to appear that I am pushing this off on someone else. I will tell you, I have been in my current position for about 18 months. I wrote my dissertation on TANF. I know TANF well. Nothing you have said, Representative, is a surprise to me. I know it. I've studied it. And so knowing those things, I will say I feel like I am now in a position, with the support of our secretary, to make changes that, yes, need to be made if we're truly committed to serving Kansans.
Okay, well, I can assure you that you'll have the legislators' support, and thank you for doing it. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Yes, so are the checks that they have to come in and check in personally, or are they able to do that via video conference or
That
other means?
that is something that I have already changed. And even with that, it sounds like it's easier if I can just participate in a Teams meeting. What's my data plan for my cell phone? Do I have a cell phone where I can participate in a Teams meeting with my career navigator? So one of the things that we are looking at is what makes the most sense for the client. And so if transportation is an issue for me, why do I have to come to the DCF office? Why can't the career navigator meet me at the library, public place, which is 3 blocks from my house? I can get there, but I can't get 5 miles to the DCF office. So how do we think outside the box to meet our clients where they are on their $326 a month for a family of 3, instead of forcing them to come to us and miss that day of work and get those points where I'm not likely to be able to keep my job?
Okay, thank you. I'm glad you're looking into that. Are you also checking to make sure that it is legal? We do have a lot of illegals crossing into the state now, and that is a major issue in many of our constituencies.
We do have an electronic interface with the Social Security Administration. So part of the routine eligibility process for any of our programs is to check that. So yes, we are looking at Social Security numbers to make sure that they match the client who is going to be receiving benefits.
Okay, and are you also implementing, I think there's a state statute that requires that they have the Social Security for at least 1 year. So that way, when they do come in and apply,
Yes.
You are checking that? Yes. Okay, great, thank you. Committee, Representative Williams.
Thank you. And also, is there a way we can get the report that you referenced about Change Agent, the report?
Change and Innovation Agency?
Yes.
Absolutely.
Okay. And then just real quick, going back to Senator Ware's question about the $326 and about the goals are that individuals are promoted in their job preparation, marriage, and all of those things. But $326, is that a statutory, where is that number from?
That is not. That is from 1997. It is in the agency's regulations.
So it's a rules and regs, so it could be changed?
Absolutely.
Because in reality, it seems like with all the spending, I know that there's more money going to service block grants and childcare development, but rather than putting money into new childcare facilities, you could give it to individuals to make their own determination for childcare, because most people can at least earn $10 an hour. I mean, most help wanted signs at hospitality restaurants are offering $15 an hour. You're not giving any of those families an opportunity to move up, because for that amount of money, are they even working? How many hours do they even have to work? And we're allowing 2 years of that. So that doesn't seem to really promote what we say we want to promote. And that, to your point, is a rules and regs. And it seems like if we're really going to help people, we should help people, and rather than build institutions and programs. Thank you.
Senator Thompson.
Thank you. And to dovetail with that question, within this report, it talked about the earning. We've lost 49% of the spending power of that dollars. So if we all of a sudden inflation adjusts from 97 to now, that would be a significant increase, and that would also bring a lot of people onto the rolls that we may not be able to afford. Do you have any estimation of how many people that would suddenly become eligible if you inflation adjusted for that amount of time?
That is something that we're looking at currently, and then what does that adjustment look like? I can tell you today, the average TANF family is, the TANF benefit is somewhere between, I believe, 15 and 19% of the federal poverty level. So even if we increase it, we can't increase it to 100%, but if we increase it to 35% of FPL or 40% of FPL, we're looking at how that would impact our current TANF spending. How long would we be able to sustain that increase before we would have to pull money from other programs? And I would say going along with that is evaluating other programs. Are they effective? Because maybe just to say that we're pulling money away from other programs, are we pulling money away from a program that is ineffective? And we don't know. We do not have the information to be able to make that decision.
It's not a simple solution, because just inflation adjustment would create all sorts of variables that
Yes.
it would be difficult to account for.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Representative Francis.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So the cliff at the $118, is that a state regulation, or is there any federal prohibitions from a glide path?
The benefit cliff when someone loses
Yeah.
access to TANF, no, there's no federal regulation. That it's on us. So there are options. We have up to 60 months that we could allow benefits for a family on TANF. Maybe we kind of ease people down. So if I'm after 24 months, maybe can I still get 50% of my benefit and then 25%? We have some options.
Well, and I was thinking more specifically, not so much as far as the length of time, but as far as the income. You know, you get a 50-cent an hour raise, and all of a sudden you hit that cliff, and it doesn't add up to the $118 a month.
That is correct. You would no longer be eligible for TANF. We do have what we call a work incentive payment. So if you are no longer eligible for TANF because you now exceed income, you can get a benefit of $50 per month for up to 5 months to help with that cliff. However, those 5 months count toward your 24-month lifetime limit.
So these are administrative rules, not something that the legislature has restricted and created that.
24 months is legislative.
No, I knew that.
Okay.
But the cliff is not. If it is, we need to put in legislation.
It would likely take a legislative action because we're limited to that 24 months. And so we could change the $50, and we could change the $50 a month.
Apples and oranges. The cliff has nothing to do with the 24 months. We're trying to figure out whether you can adjust the cliff through rules and regs, or whether we need to put in legislation to do that for income.
If we're using TANF funds to do it, if we're going to count those months as TANF months, then that would take a legislative change. But we could create a program, fund that program with TANF that would allow benefits that would not be included, that would not be countable as a TANF month.
Through rules and regs.
Correct.
There's quite a bit of authority there, so I just want to make clear. Representative Francis.
Yeah, I don't want to beat a dead horse here, and I don't know where the income levels are, but let's say the income level is 12,000. You can, by rules and regs, make it so that when they make 12,500, instead of getting 118 a month, that they can get $68 a month.
Yes.
By rules and regs, for getting the 24 months.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
As long as we don't count it as a TANF month. I can say another option is to work with a community organization. So if you have a community organization that's partially TANF funded, we could also refer that family to that organization who could provide that monthly benefit that then it's definitely not a countable TANF month.
But is the reason you can't use TANF funds because of a federal rule?
No.
Because of a state statute?
We do not have, no, we just don't have a program. We do not have a program that would allow us to do that. There's no state statute that prevents us from providing assistance to those families outside of their 24 months of TANF. Does that make sense?
I think we're off topic here. So I'm going to rein us back in on the audit. We will ask you to come back the next meeting and present the information that was requested. And maybe we could get clarification as to rules and regs versus legislation. Okay,
you.
Great. Thank you, committee. We'll move on to our next audit. It's ks.gov IT monitoring. Katrin, I am just butchering everyone's name today.
It's fine. Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the committee. I will give a very brief update to the ks.gov IT project that we're currently monitoring. You should have a 4-page memo in your binder. Looks like this, kind of a memo-looking thing. The first thing that you will notice is that this is an update for the quarter ending June 30th. Time has marched on since, obviously, with the third quarter ending soon. And essentially what that means is that this update is a little bit stale at this point. But since it is one of our functions we are carrying out on an ongoing basis, I will hit the main takeaways for you. So we started monitoring this IT project this past January. 2 agencies are collaborating on this IT project. This is ks.gov for child care licensing, as well as the Department of Children and Families for foster care facility licensing. And so this includes associated processes for facility inspections, background checks, renewals, enforcement, those types of things. So last January, ks.gov signed a $4.3 million contract to create a licensing solution using a software as a service model. And this will replace the current Claris IT system. That system is outdated and has a lot of limitations. So now on to our monitoring results for this second quarter. And I am on page 2 of the memo if you're following along. As of June 30th, the project scope was satisfactory. The scope has been agreed to by both state agencies as well as the contractor. And at the end of that second quarter, there were no change requests to the scope. As of June 30th, the cost also was satisfactory. The project has a fixed price contract, which will get paid with federal funds based on 25 deliverables. At the end of the second quarter, the contractor received $691,000 for 3 completed and accepted deliverables. As of June 30th, the project was in alert status for schedule. The estimated completion date for this project is October 2025. At the end of the second quarter, state officials could not easily determine whether the project was on schedule. And that is because there are two main project artifacts that help track progress, and they do not correlate well, and they have limitations. So let me unpack this for you a little bit. The first artifact that I'm referring to is an approved Microsoft project schedule. That one reflects major milestones. It also has a lot of subtasks. It is actually very detailed, very minute. That document is required per state project management guidelines. The problem we noted is that it did not contain the deadlines for the 25 deliverables, and it also was unclear who was responsible to revise the document when there are certain tasks that were slipping. The second schedule-related artifact is the contractor's portal. And this is software that allows both parties to review work in progress, accept finished work, and a whole lot of other things. However, this software automatically reschedules tasks and milestones tasks if they are late or get canceled. So it's essentially always on time because things get updated automatically. So that doesn't help effectively manage and monitor how late a project might become. So at the end of the quarter, really, neither of those two artifacts appeared to provide a clear sense of completed work, and more importantly, whether the project was falling behind given a few tasks that did not get finished based on the original deadlines. And that brings me to the last bullet there. Project was satisfactory in planning for security. And with that, I stand for questions.
Thank you. Committee, any questions? Well, you got off easy. Thank you, Ketrin. Next on the committee is the legislative post-audit budget. Chris, thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the committee. I believe the budget is in tab A of your binders. The executive subcommittee of this committee met today at 12:30 to go over the budget, and they have preliminarily approved it as presented. So now it comes to the full committee. There is a memo there with some narrative, and on the backside is a summary, high-level summary of the resources and expenditures showing 24 actual, 25 revised, and 26 requests. I'd be happy to stand for any questions the committee may have.
Thank you. Seeing none? That was probably the easiest one we've had so far. Committee, do we have a motion to approve the budget? Representative Francis.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I move to approve the legislative post-audits fiscal year 25-26 budget revision and request.
It's been moved by Representative Francis, seconded by Representative Probst. Discussion on the motion. Seeing none, all those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, nay. Motion carries. Yes. Representative Williams, yes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to make a comment on the performance measures. We usually don't get really helpful performance measures, but you provided 3 here, and I really appreciate the fact that it actually outlines how much each audit on average costs, and it's actually meaningful performance measures that we don't often see in appropriations. Thank you.
Thank you.
And just so you know, cost is sort of a relative term as we're funded, for the year as a state agency as appropriation, but we sort of calculate a cost. Sometimes we get asked that question.
Thank you. I would also appreciate that they did turn money back in for second year in a row that I'm aware of. I'm sure it's been more than that, but appreciate your efforts. Thank you, Chris. We'll move on to the next item on the agenda, and that is Chris's evaluation.
This way, I'm primarily just briefing the committee on the post-audit executive, or the post-auditor annual evaluation. By statute, this committee evaluates my performance each year. Historically, that has been done via a survey sent out by Tom Day of Administrative Services. The survey goes to you all. You respond to the survey directly to Tom Day. The results are compiled and then presented to me in December in executive session. The executive subcommittee has approved to do the same process again this year, but it's coming before the full committee, just for your approval or disagreement or any other input.
Any comments or any changes you would like to see to the process? Okay, we don't need to move on it, so thank you, Chris. We'll look forward to that in December. Okay, we'll begin with the security audits. Representative Francis. Committee, we do have a 10-minute break on the schedule. Would you like to do that? Okay, we'll come back at, okay, I think okay, we were at 2:33, so let's say 2:45. Okay. 2:45. We do have one committee member, Representative, all right, Senator Ware, bravo. Representative Francis.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I move that we recess this open meeting for a closed meeting pursuant to KSA 754319A to discuss matters relating to the security measures that protect the information systems of Kansas, Department of Education, the Kansas Historical Society, Leonard State Hospital, and Osawatomie State Hospital with the appropriate individuals under the justification listed in KSA 754319B 12C, because discussion of such matters in an open meeting would jeopardize such security measures. To resume the open meeting in room 546 South at 40410, and to record this motion if adopted as part of the committee's permanent records.
Do we have a second? It's been moved by Representative Francis, seconded by Senator Peterson. Discussion on the motion? Seeing none. All those in favor? Aye. All those opposed? Nay. Motion carries. We are in executive session. Well, welcome back, committee. Thank you. We'll go ahead and get started, Kristen, with the consent calendar, our last item on the agenda.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee. So if you'll flip to tab C in your notebooks, that's where you'll find the consent calendar. There are several items on today's consent calendar, so I will walk you through them. There are attachments within that tab that I will refer to. So the first item on the consent calendar is approval of the committee's last 3 meeting minutes. So you can find those as attachments A, B, and C in your tab C of your notebook. There is also, the second item is acceptance of the performance audits that were presented today in the IT security audits. So that would include the low-income housing tax credit program, the TANF program, and then the 4 IT security audits that you all just heard. And then the third item on the consent calendar is approval of there are 3 different limited scope audits. So just as a reminder to you all, the chair has preliminarily approved all 3 limited scope audit requests, which you can find in attachments D, E, and F. Any member who has an objection to a limited scope audit can state such objection in the form of a motion to remove the limited scope audit from the list of approved audits and to treat it as a regular performance audit. Otherwise, the 3 limited scope audits and the acceptance of the performance audits and approval of the minutes would all happen without any committee action needed. So I can briefly walk you through those 3 limited scope audits. If you'll turn to attachment D, the first one, and actually the second one, both deal with the same program. So that is the Building a Stronger Economy grant program. It used federal dollars to address infrastructure and economic development projects that were delayed due to the COVID-19 pandemic. It was overseen by the Department of Commerce. And this first proposal would have us look at one of the recipients of the first round of grant funding, which is that business is called Soft Warfare LLC. So it would have us look at basically how that recipient spent the grant funding and if that's in alignment with its grant award. And I should point out that this audit proposal was requested by Representative Blue. Then the next audit proposal is in attachment E, also dealing with the base grant. This one is requested by a number of members on this committee, and it would have us look at how the Department of Commerce evaluated applications to that grant program. So we would look at basically everyone who applied, those who received the funding, and those who did not, and kind of look at the scoring process that the department used. And then attachment F is the third and final limited scope audit before you today. This one would also look at the Department of Commerce, again requested by many members of this committee, and would have us look at the department's pre-employment screening process for staff who oversee financial matters. So we would look at, this would be like a sample of staff that we would look into from relatively recent time frame. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions from the committee.
Thank you, Kristen. Also, Representative Blue is online for anybody that has questions for that audit. Representative Williams.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And this question actually goes to our first proposal here, limited scope audit relating to the business in Great Bend that was presented by Representative Blue. And so the last bullet point you have is you're going to talk to Commerce staff and software LLC officials as needed to understand the cost of any issues with its application. Okay, so when you're talking to Commerce, again, I'm going back to that transparency database, and I can see on here that we gave them $3 million. I can see that it's supposed to be at Great Bend at 2nd and South Patton Road. I would love to know in here in a minute if Representative Blue, if there's anybody that has moved into that area. And then it goes on. So my point is when you're talking to Commerce, could you come back to what they have inserted on their transparency database? Because they say that this entity provided a total capital investment of 4.2 million. So I'm really curious, and I don't see that particularly on the scope, but I would ask about that. And then it also says not applicable on jobs. And then it has award agreement. It says achieved, what is that? First disbursement, achieved, quarterly reports. It doesn't, and that's the thing about this database here. I hate to, beat this out, but it doesn't give us, we're supposed to be, as the public, just agree it's achieved. You don't attach it, you don't do anything. So everything that's provided on this, I hope you will include that in your talk to Commerce staff. Thank you.
Kristen, do you want to address that, and then Representative Blue?
Sure. So I think that, one thing that we would definitely do as part of this is request copies of the actual applications from the companies, but I think that one of our steps could be to compare, like for this particular one, how that matches to the information on their transparency database.
Thank you. Representative Blue?
Yes, thank you, committee. Can you guys hear me? I'm driving. I want to make sure you guys can hear me first.
We can hear you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Representative Williams, really great question. And I think this is exactly why, one of the major reasons why I requested this audit. If you look at the secretary or on the Commerce website, when he goes to base grants, if you look at their website, it has a timeline of when these grants were awarded, when the grantees were supposed to implement everything, so forth. And we have surpassed that deadline. And to this date, I've yet to see this business in the city of Great Bend or surrounding areas. I hear from the Department of Commerce that there's a supply chain issue, but my worrisome has to deal with the fact that this business is not from this area, nor have they ever been from this area, but they wrote down that they are going to be coming to the community, and I don't think it's fair that this is a situation that has been happening so far. So that's why I'm hoping that LPA will approve this audit so we can look further into this and see what's going on with this $3 million.
Thank you. Any other questions, committee? Seeing none. Thank you, Representative Blue. Senator Thompson.
Just one on that final one with background checks and stuff. I'm hopeful that you'll look at, I talked to a former colonel in the military who did security background checks, and he said it should have been very easy to find this. So hopefully you'll be able to see what avenues are available for doing those kind of background checks and, find out why they weren't followed.
I think that would be the I guess thrust of the audit proposal.
So, and thank you. That brings up an excellent point, Senator Thompson. If you would make sure in the preview or in this audit that we are looking at what alternative method. It's because I know most people may not be aware that federal law, it's kind of somewhat hokey, for lack of a better word, that if the state doesn't exclude the position, then they're not allowed to look at a certain federal criminal database. And so I think what this is going to expose that us as a legislature need to open that list up so that more of these positions can use that database. But you bring up an excellent point. Are there other checks or types of background checks that could have been done besides just that national criminal database?
Right. Do we need to expand that? Do we need to require that? Just so that we're fully vetting these people.
Yes.
So, yep. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Committee, any other questions? Representative Tarwater.
Thank you. So I guess I talked to the Department of Commerce on this, and they're under the understanding that there is a statute that prohibits them from doing a background check except for on individuals that have access to HR type information. I'd like to see which which statute that is and when we made it. I know that Governor Collier had a executive order to ban the box, but that executive order specifically said this does not preclude us from doing any background checks. And I think there was speculation that that's what caused all this, and it certainly was not, because we could still do background checks. But evidently, we passed a law at some point that prohibited background checks, and I'd like to look into that more.
So thank you, Representative. We didn't prohibit the background checks. The federal law prohibited unless we excluded the position. Like, for example, the Department of Commerce, it states specifically that they can do a criminal background check on the boxing commissioner. But it doesn't allow for any others, is how they're interpreting that statute. And so I think therein lies the confusion. Not pointing fingers here at all. It's, but we do need clarification. Tamara, I know, has that statute. Well, okay. I thought you had sent it to me. I'm sorry. Oh, yes. Okay. Yes. I've been doing a deep dive on this. It's intriguing that we would prohibit any type of background check. So we do need to clean it up, and we do need to understand where the block is that we are not able to make sure that we can get access to this information. But I'm glad you brought up the check the box, because I've heard that also. That is not what created the situation at all. So, any other questions, committee? Seeing none, I guess, is there any objection to the consent calendar? Seeing none, we'll move forward then. Thank you. And I would stand corrected. There is one more item on the agenda, the next meeting. So, Chris, do you mind? Thanks.
In your notebooks in tab D, there's sort of a listing of when we anticipate the next few possible meeting dates and what audits likely would be presented at those meetings. Correct me if I'm wrong, Madam Chair, but I believe we said October 7th is the October date, so October 7th. And that would be star bonds, TIF districts, the two small audits on the Ford County, the 2022 general and the 2024 primary, and an IT security audit on KBI is the tentative plan for that meeting. And then looking further ahead, it's all sort of tentative. We have to factor in the audits that you just approved today as well.
So thank you, Chris. Representative Williams.
Yeah. Thank you, Madam Chair. Question on that. So what length of time is that on the 7th? The reason we do have a Senate-House budget meeting that day could go perfectly to do it at the same time. Maybe it's a lunch hour one. I just wanted y'all to be aware that there is a joint Senate-House budget special meeting. But I'm sure they haven't, I think it's at 10, but maybe if they break for lunch, we could, if they do that, then we would have that opportunity. I would say maybe if you would talk to Representative Waymaster, Senator, and then maybe work that out.
Thank you. If you would take a fairly long lunch, I have a feeling this is going to take more than an hour. It looks like these audits could
probably
2 to 3
2 and a half
hours.
to 3, yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. So do we need to pick?
Or you can pick and choose and.
I mean, if it, for those, I mean, it would conflict for me, but I could get a substitute. It's the
It would
only.
conflict for me too. I'm on the same.
Yeah. Unless we start at 7 a.m.
I'd be
Which
game,
I'm
but I
okay
don't think
with.
we'd have a very good turnout. So let's check with Chairman Waymaster and see what their plans on for that day, for that schedule.
Maybe they're finish at 3 or.
Okay, yeah, and we don't want to.
I think they start at 10, so someone did want an 8 a.m., it would be possible.
So, and we could look at the 8th tentatively. I know there are some conflicts. Chris, would you guys, we'll look at that. We'll see what we can do on the 7th and possibly the 8th, because that way you could stay up here. Okay, so we'll poll the committee again. Thank you. Chris does a great job. You guys, I want to take a minute to thank staff for going over and above. They have been tremendous with all of the unprecedented, I guess, situations that have come up. I received a call from the speaker, which I greatly appreciated, and it's just nice that everybody is working together and going over and above to perform and to complete these things on time. I know it's not easy, so much appreciated. Any other questions or business to be brought before the committee? Seeing none, we're adjourned. Thank you.